Hi, I'm Tanya Notley. I'm joined by Rachel Sharples, who is a senior researcher with the Challenging Racism project here at Western. Thanks so much for joining us, Rachel.
Glad to be here.
Can you please tell us about the Challenging Racism project? How long has it been going for? What's its goals, and what sort of things does it include?
Yeah, so the project itself has been running for over a decade now. It's been at Western, I think, since about 2008, and it was with academics at other institutions before that. I think initially it was set up as a project that was looking at sort of national attitudes and experiences around racism in Australia. And what's happened, I guess, particularly over the last sort of 5 years, is there's been much more of a diversification of projects under that. So we're looking now, some of the key areas we're looking at are cyber racism, so what's happening online, Facebook, Twitter, that kind of thing in terms of racist comment. We're also looking more at sort of racism and bullying in schools. We've got a couple of projects around that, particularly primary school, and sort of interventions that could happen in those spaces. We do a lot of work around anti-racism now as well, so not just looking at sort of racist attitudes and behaviours, but also trying to work out strategies and interventions of anti-racism, like how you can address racism. So they're sort of the key areas, and it adapts, I guess, to what's going on, particularly in Australian society. And we're always looking at what's happening in that space and where interventions or what needs are needing to be addressed. So that's why we sort of have diversified out a little bit. Yeah.
So it seems like there's a real mix of those national studies, understanding attitudes and perceptions, as well as interventions. You clearly, the project team, really want to make a difference in addressing racism in Australia.
I think one of the key things that we do at Challenging Racism Project is always looking for ways to try and address it as well. So that it's not just theoretical or academic based, but that we're also looking for practical ways for people to actually address it, in the everyday kind of sphere as well.
In terms of that national data, which I've explored in the past, what do we know about the geographies of racism in Australia? Do we find some states have more racist attitudes than others? What do we learn by looking at the big picture?
Yeah, I think you can draw a few things, from looking at big picture and then drilling down. I mean, we hear lots of, stereotypes around Queensland and Tasmania, those sort of state-based things. And, to a certain extent, we do see differences in attitudes and experiences at that state level. I wouldn't say they're necessarily as significant as we might think when we're talking about those sort of stereotypes, just generally. Some of the things that we've also looked at is differences between, say, metropolitan or city areas and country areas. And again, you can see, I don't think it's as simple as saying, country areas have, higher rates or experiences of racism, or they are more racist. I don't think it's as simplistic as that. You can't see that as clearly in the data. But certainly we can see some differences in how those different geolocations react to it. And I think one of the key aspects of understanding that is exposure. So we would find, for example, that city areas have sort of higher appreciations maybe of cultural diversity and exposure to cultural diversity that you might not see in country areas, just for that simple fact that there's not a high proportion of migrant communities in certain country areas.
Drilling down from your data from a few years ago, I was really surprised that the place I grew up, which is very multicultural in Western Sydney, Blacktown, had much higher levels of ethnic diversity. Actually had more racist perceptions and attitudes than the place I live now in the inner west that has far less diversity. And that was quite uncomfortable and strange for me.
Yeah, it's an interesting one and there's a lot of research on this around exposure. So we often hear in research that exposure is a really useful strategy for trying to reduce stereotypes and certain ideas people have around cultural groupings. But exposure, I think we've learnt through research, exposure on its own is not enough. And so what you're probably talking about when we're talking about, say, inner west and Blacktown experiences is that sometimes exposures can be quite negative, and the impact then on people drills down in a negative way as well, so that that exposure, if it's a continuous sort of negative exposure, then it is actually going to reinforce negative stereotypes rather than trying to reduce or to encourage cultural diversity. So it's not I wouldn't say it's that uncommon to see those kind of things happening. I actually come from a country area like Tamworth, whereas where I grew up, and Moree, which is a town near there, has a high Aboriginal population, but research shows that lots of people in Moree have very negative stereotypes around Aboriginal people. They have a high exposure to them, but they're mostly negative experiences with Aboriginal people. So therefore it's, you know, it's all about then what kind of exposure people are having to different ethnic racial groupings. Yeah,
shows how complicated it is in terms of understanding the impact or effects of racism on people in Australia. Have you also looked into that? What the kind of psychological and social impacts are?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, this is a really key area where you're talking about health and well-being kind of stats. So there's a lot of research. We've done a little bit on this. There's a lot of other researchers that we've worked quite closely with that have done quite a bit of work on what those sort of morbidity outcomes are. But yeah, I mean, research definitely shows that high experience and sustained experiences of racism have a very negative impact on people's mental health, well-being, their capacity to integrate or assimilate or feel like they belong in Australia. Like, they're very negative impacts. I mean, there's a lot of research now that also shows negative impacts in terms of our economy when people don't or don't feel like they belong or they're not integrating. You know, so it's a whole range of things. Like, we often think about them in health terms, but research has shown that those impacts are across a whole range of societal factors, whether it's the economy, whether it's access to education, it's, you know, reduced health benefits. So yeah, the impact is quite significant, particularly when we're talking about sustained and repeated incidents of racism.
I know you've done some work on the media and racism in Australia. I guess it's very difficult sometimes to understand what role the media are playing to disentangle all of the factors that lead to kind of racist attitudes. What do you think about the role the media play in Australia?
Yeah, I think it is complex. Like, it's easy sometimes, I think, to blame media for portrayals and certainly for perpetuating negative stereotypes. But yeah, I think they're complex discussions. Like, I think what we would find, like some of the stuff that we've looked at, is actually the perceptions from migrant communities themselves of how they've been represented in media, and that's often seen as unfair and biased. But, you know, as with always with media, they've got quite a reach, particularly commercial media, and so the images that they project do have impact and do have effect on not only on, I guess, the targeted communities, particularly if they're negative stereotypes, but also on how the rest of the population then perceives those communities. So it's far too simplistic to lay that blame on the media, but I think there is certainly a role the media can play in developing more positive images of certain migrant communities rather than reinforcing stereotypes.
So of course we do have the ABC Charter, which tries to address issues of representation. Do you think we need more initiatives in Australia to ensure that the media not only don't recreate racist stereotypes, but also support the understanding and perception of Australia as a multicultural nation?
Look, I think certainly the research that we did looking at migrant communities' perceptions of the media, the data certainly shows that that media organisations like ABC and SBS, for example, that there's a much stronger in agreeance that they represent migrant communities in much more balanced and fair ways. I mean, there's still a high percentage, I would say, that don't think that they're fair and representing in that way, but it's a much bigger percentage than, say, the commercial news media. The percentages in the commercial news media are very low for how people perceive them being fair and in their representation. So, like, you know, the assumption I guess you could make there is that charters like the ABC have had an impact because it's perceived in the community as presenting them in much more balanced ways. I guess it always depends on what that charter or policy might look like. One of the things we recommended to a government inquiry last year was actually greater training of migrant communities themselves to play larger roles in media organisations, or at least being commentary or op-ed sort of roles. So that's another thing that we would recommend, not necessarily just the policy basis within those organisations, but trying to give voice to more of the community in those spaces as well.
My final question is around social media. Obviously, social media has opened up the opportunity for just that, for providing a platform for more voices to be heard. But what do you think is happening in the Australian context? Do you feel that social media has contributed to more racism, has made it more visible to us? And do you think that there's any kind of changes or policies that we need to think of in that regard?
Yeah. I mean, look, social media has opened up that space to not only just, en masse, the amount of people that are contributing to those, but also the diversity of voices within that space. I remember talking to someone last year actually who was looking at the role that social media played with youth and whether or not it was contributing to youth being more sort of racially aware and having more positive sort of anti-racism stances. I mean, what we've looked at so far shows actually that social media has less accountability, has less regulation, and therefore is actually a space where people can be much more racist than they might be in normal everyday life, particularly in face-to-face situations. So there's that aspect of it. It actually enables it to a certain extent. But it does also, I guess the flip side of that is that it also gives a lot of people who might not have a voice in the mainstream media context to actually have a voice in that social media space. But certainly some of the work we're moving into around cyber racism is around like better regulation of those social media platforms. So if you look at the Twitter and the Facebook sort of policies around this kind of thing, they're possibly quite weak, I guess you could say. And even if they do exist, to a certain extent, it's how they're implemented, and that's a very grey area. So we see a lot of cases, like for Twitter, for example, where it seems difficult for us to understand why one tweet might have been taken down, while others that are clearly racist or sexist, homophobic, whatever, stay up. So it's also about regulating those, having better regulation in those platforms, I think, to deal with those kind of incidents. Yeah.
Rachel, do you have any suggestions for people? We all consume media every day. We see it from morning to night. How we might start seeing and analysing and critiquing the stereotypes that we see in the Australian media?
Like, I think the important thing with looking at what is presented to us and then deciding about stereotypes, I think we can probably say that you are confronted with stereotypes all day, every day in your life. Whether or not you recognise them as stereotypes, I think is an area that we could be more critical in. For examples, I can think of some, like of catching the train here and seeing posters on the station. An example might be like representing some kind of community event where everyone is white, for example. And so it's that representation of Australian society that gets reinforced, that we are a white people, rather than acknowledging the diversity or the multicultural kind of nature of Australia. But in terms of determining whether something is a stereotype or not, I think mostly what we would say through our research is there's examples of, you might get a meme on social media and you're not sure whether or not it's appropriate. It's hard with social media because you don't really know where that's come from or who's created it. And they're kind of key things when you're trying to work out stereotypes, like, who made it, what's their intention or motivation. And that can give you clues as to whether or not it's something that might be acceptable or it might not. But that's, they're kinds of things that become harder, like depending on the media source that you're getting it from, to determine like whether or not that's going to be appropriate. But mostly we would say through our research, a stereotype comes when someone is sort of intentionally portraying what they think are certain identifiers of a cultural, racial, ethnic grouping, but they're lumping all of that, they're lumping all that group together under these stereotypes, and that lacks like seeing the diversity within communities and the diversity within any community when you try and start to group them all under these certain categorisations, I guess.
Rachel, thanks so much for joining us. I'm just so glad we've got the Challenging Racism project here on Western. Can students get involved in the project?
They sure can. We've got, they can contact us through Facebook and Twitter. So Twitter is at Challenge Racism. Facebook, if you search for Challenging Racism Project. We've got our website, as well, that you can find all our research projects and all the publications and data that we've been talking about today. And we'd encourage, we've got lots of HDR students that are involved in our work, and we encourage students to come along and check out our work and get involved as well.
Thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. Good to be here.